Welcome back to the final installment of The First Americans. I'm your host, Christian Jardine. I gotta stop doing that. It's too much fun, though. We left off here. So, we're now going to get into the specific regional groups in North America, starting as I outlined previously in the subarctic. In some cases, I will have written in parentheses, as I do here, one particular tribe or pretty well-known group or more, in this case the Inuit, but they are certainly not the only Native American group in the Archaic period to live in the subarctic region. Professors McNeil and McNeil, a father and son team, who don't usually write or work together, but they did in this one interesting volume in a book on global world history, said by any standard their, meaning the peoples of the subarctic, achievement in exploiting the bleak environment ranks as an amazing example of human ingenuity. And they go into a lot of specifics. The whaling economy. Whale was the major commodity, the major food source, whales, and as you might imagine, they're not all that easy to catch and kill. But the Inuit and other groups built boats that could carry as many as 8 people. They built different types of harpoons, skin floats. They had somewhat some amount of hierarchy. Whale boat captains that became kind of social leaders, kind of a small-scale top-down structure to their society. Not all Native American hunter-gatherer groups, most of them don't, have such structures. There's more egalitarianism than there is hierarchy. This is an exception. They stored and froze meat underground, which took some technological doing, even in a cold climate. They used every part of the whale, as Native Americans always did. We've already seen in our look at the global hunter-gatherer way of life that they used everything that they could possibly think of to squeeze something as much out of nature as they possibly could to their own advantage. Use whale blubber for oil, to cook, to light lamps, and on, as well as just eating it. All Inuit equipment was ingenious, McNeil and McNeil conclude, including tailored fur and skin clothing, large and small skin boats, bows and arrows, dog sleds, snow igloos, sophisticated harpoons, and much else. This is also a great example of the propensity for human beings to be remarkably ingenious, to show incredible ability to adapt and human ingenuity. This is a formidable climate most of the time, and not only did these people survive here, they were able to thrive in this area. Moving now to the Great Plains, a gigantic area in now the middle of the United States, including states like Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana, etc. This was, at the time, in the Archaic period, the most populous part of North America. About 1 in 7 Archaic peoples, or early Native Americans, lived on the Great Plains. Which must tell us that there was abundant foodstuffs and other materials, resources necessary for a livable lifestyle. Having the right weapons was important here on the plains. As Professor Rourke says, bows and arrows reached the Great Plains from the north about 50 A.D. They largely replaced spears, which had been the hunter's weapon of choice for millennia. Bows permitted hunters to wound animals from farther away, obviously. The arrow made it possible to shoot repeatedly, and arrowheads were easier to make and therefore less costly to lose. So if you lost a spear or spear point, or it somehow broke, it's more costly. So there were a lot of reasons then that the bow and arrow was a major technological advantage for Native Americans, also in warfare as well. So you see the picture here, which shows another way of hunting that existed on the plains and elsewhere as well. This is pretty well known. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but this is an organizational plan. We talked about that before, having a plan, written here as well, again, but driving the large megafauna animals off of a cliff in a large number. Again, this is done in other places as well, but it's a good example of how having a plan, sequential thought sequences. If you do this, then you do this, and having to execute that, sort of blueprint is necessary to hunt something this formidable, a herd of buffalo. So, you can't just show up and kind of get these things to run off of a cliff. It has to be well thought out, planned, prepared, and executed, or it's not going to happen. So it's a good example of the complexity of thinking that survival, makes obligatory for such peoples. Nomadic groups here in this area relied heavily on the buffalo for survival until, of course, they more or less, or nature more or less, made such animals extinct. And this is partly, I think, why the bow and arrow enters the scene, because after the buffalo are gone and the megafaunal animals are gone, it gets tougher in a way, because what you have left are smaller, faster animals, like deer, say, antelope, whatever exists in the plains. I'm not an expert in zoology, especially on the Great Plains, but you could see that a spear would not be that easy, number one, on something like a small, faster deer, and two, in kind of the wide open spaces that are often part of the Great Plains. I think if we think of Great Plains today, we tend to think of like Big Sky, Montana, wide open plains. So with a spear, I don't care if you're Tom Brady, you're not going to hit a deer running. But with a bow and arrow, yeah, now that becomes a realistic possibility. This is then in part also an example of what one historian long ago called challenge and response, which most historians don't use as a tool today. This is yet another tool I'm adding to our tool kit of ideas and tools, methods for studying history. But I think this one is still effective. I know a few historians, one at Stanford, that still uses the concept. I think it has some explanatory power. So the concept is quite simple, that when human beings, when societies, communities are faced with a big enough challenge, the bigger the challenge, the more likely they are to come up with a response. Why? Because they have to. Now, what are the dynamics that causes this to happen? Well, it's not wishful thinking. Of course, they don't say, "Well, we need a response. We need a successful, solution to this problem. We need okay, we have it." So, what is it that is the mechanism that explains it? And this is actually an easy question and a hard question at the same time. I sometimes ask this question live to students, and it's rare that someone gets the answer. And I get why. Part of it's because they're thinking of something more complicated than what we really need. But the answer, of course, is if say the buffalo are gone, now this picture is now obsolete, it's deer, and spears aren't cutting it. And so the leader of the group says, we've got to come up with another technology to hunt some of these smaller, faster animals, or we're going to all die of starvation. This is priority number one. We need to spend all of our time and effort, all of us, every day, until we figure this out, until we have something that works. Otherwise, we're going under. So it's the fact that they're going to put so much time, effort, resources, brain power into the effort that makes it likely that a challenge, in this case the challenge is finding ways to hunt a new food supply, the response is successfully achieving that. Say the bow and arrow is the answer. Now say a neighboring group who might have hunted the buffalo too, but now they've disappeared. But that group lives in, say, a slightly different ecosystem again, it's a rough analogy here, or not rough example, I should say. Let's say that group has plenty of other foodstuffs that it's not an emergency for them. Well, they're not as likely to respond with something like a bow and arrow. And by the way, the bow and arrow came from the north anyway, so this is a hypothetical example. They didn't invent it here, but it doesn't matter. The concept is what's important here. So the neighboring people, all right, their leader, where it's not as much of an emergency, is likely to say, well, okay, we could use some, food security, some extra sources of nourishment from some of these smaller, faster animals. So why don't, you guys over there, a few of you over there, start working on this and see if you can come up with something. So he's not sort of making this an emergency, not mobilizing the whole society to solve the problem, because it's not a life or death existential challenge. So it's when the challenge is greatest that the response is most likely to be successful. It's never certain that it's going to be successful, and if it's not, in an emergency situation, then the society, the community, is either going to stagnate or entirely collapse. And that certainly happens in history. We'll see one example of it in this very lecture. Now moving to the eastern woodlands, and it's a large geographical area. The map there, you can see it moves around the Great Lakes area. So in the northern part of it, it's modern-day Canada. South of the Great Lakes and east is the United States, Illinois, all the way to the East Coast, and the New England states by today's measurements. And so in those days, the wilderness, forested woodland areas were thick with trees. Thick with trees. Europeans, when they come over for the first time and sort of see these areas, explore them, they try to take them. They're shocked by how much woodland, how much forest there is, and how thick it is. That's mainly because Europe, which is a continent that had a great deal of dense, thick forest, naturally, was further along in urban agricultural development, as I've already said. So they've been cutting down forests for centuries. Right? You have to cut down forests both to clear land to farm and to build cities and towns. So since Native Americans are only starting to do that, they haven't cleared out forests. So Europeans are not used to this, but it's the norm for Native Americans, at least in these kind of areas. So quite thick forested areas in the region you see in the tan and on the map. Deer was the most important food here, obtained through hunting. Bow and arrows appear to have been in use. They also did some gathering of edible plants. And around 6,000 years ago, some established permanent settlements of 25 to maybe 150 or so people, which is an example of yet another one of those groups, few as they are. Here's yet another one that moved to permanent settlements before they started to do and employ farming, which they probably already knew how to do but didn't want to, because there was plenty of wild growing or wild growing plants that were edible, and plenty of animals running around, and so they didn't move to farming. Around 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years later, they did either learn or employ agriculture, which, by the way, was probably developed by women, not just here, but possibly in most or all parts of the world that moved to farming. Why? Well, most of it, I think, is based on logic, not so much evidence, but it does make sense that, and I didn't say this before, but in hunter-gatherer societies, this isn't 100% true, but there was a sexual division of labor, meaning men did most of the hunting, women did most of the gathering. So not 100% true, but mostly. Why? Well, the male macho answer to this is sort of, bigger, stronger for hunting. That's certainly, I think, part of it. But the bigger part of the answer is that women, of course, are the ones who bear children and carry children and nurse infants. So that keeps them kind of tied closer to home. You take little kids out on a hunt, right? It's going to be chaos. Little kids run around and run away from mommy and daddy. So the men more often are the ones that go away on a hunt with the women that are pregnant or nursing, little ones, infants, dealing with toddlers, stay closer to home and go shorter distances to pick wild growing fruits and vegetables. But because women did most of the gathering, they're the ones who likely had the most intimate, in-depth knowledge of plant life. Why? Because that's what they're doing every day, is going out and picking, finding the wild-growing plants, the edible plants. We know they had very complex algorithms, sort of strategies for what plants to skip, which ones to rely on. When, under what circumstances do we avoid this one and hold out for something better? And it was probably women that did that, because and that it was women that did that, excuse me, but it was probably them that learned how to do planting seeds, harvesting crops, and understanding, okay, it takes water and sunlight and all these different features to grow crops, and we can do that on our own now. By the same token, it was likely that men worldwide were the first to figure out how to domesticate animals. Why? Because they're the ones who have to have an intimate knowledge of animals. If you don't understand animal behavior and animal patterns and know animal tracks, you probably shouldn't hunt them because it's probably just dangerous. So men with the deeper, more detailed knowledge of animals probably were the ones who learned to domesticate them, and women were the ones who probably learned to farm because that was their job more often, to deal with plant life. So women appear to have developed agriculture, at least here, but probably far and wide as well. The Eastern woodland peoples and cultures pursued an in-between survival strategy, it appears, so that for a time they straddled both hunting and gathering and farming, which makes sense. You kind of get the best of both worlds. So there's some other peoples around the world that sort of practiced both. Around 4,000 years ago, this group of people also in this region developed pottery, which sounds like, who cares? But I use it here as an example of something. Archaeologists by now, and have for a long time, know that when they find one item on an archaeological site, dig, that likely means that something else is there. So there are various connections that they make. So when pottery, shards of pottery are unearthed, dug up, it's a clear sign that this is likely, and maybe for sure, an area that had urban development. There's likely a village or a town or towns under here somewhere. Even if you haven't found it, even if they don't find it ever, they're still going to probably be convinced that it's here. I mean, we might not have found it, but it must have been here. Why? Hunter-gatherers don't make pots. Why not? Well, pots are heavier. Hunter-gatherers move around a lot. The more optimal, carrying vessel for hunter-gatherers are baskets. Baskets make sense for hunter-gatherers. People living in sedentary, settled conditions use baskets, I'm sure too. But it makes sense for them also to think about pottery. It's not just the pots are heavy, but kilns that fire the pottery are heavy and not exactly that mobile. So when you find shards of pottery, if you're an archaeologist, you pretty much know, okay, this was at least at one point in the past, there was an ancient urban settlement development here. This group also appears to have done long-distance trade as far away as Mexico. Now we move to the American Southeast and to the Mississippian mound builders. Mississippian, easy to spell, hard to spell. We learned this in what grade? I forget now. It's been so long for me. But the Mississippian mound builders or cultures were cultures over a vast array of territory, not just on the Mississippi River, but around it, and including some of the Mississippi's tributaries. The Mississippi River is so large, if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's remarkable, that a lot of its tributaries are huge rivers in their own right. So this group of people lived and flourished in the Caribbean, the Mississippi Basin, not just the Mississippi River itself. They're referred to sometimes as mound builders because of the gigantic earthen mounds or earthworks that they created and built. You see represented here in a picture. So this is kind of like the Egyptian pyramids, only not with stones, but sort of piled up earth. Some of them are as big in terms of the space they take up, their mass as the Egyptian pyramids, but maybe not quite as impressive a technological achievement just because it's not gigantic stones of 5.5 tons or whatever. Nonetheless, this is still impressive development, technological development, no doubt. In the Mississippian cultures, and you see a map on the left, each one of those little green things, it looks like a badminton birdie, is an unearthed archaeological site. So there's been lots of digs, and you also see then the expansive territory that makes up the Mississippian cultures. Again, much of the Mississippi Basin. The political systems that developed here were somewhat, not completely unique. There are other Native American areas, but this is different than in some other places. Scholars sometimes refer to these as paramount chiefdoms. And I don't want to get into too much detail on this. It can get kind of complicated. But I'll use a very rough comparison. And it is rough, but it'll work. If you've ever studied, and if you haven't, I guess this won't be of much use, European history, or the history of the Middle East, you've studied city-states. There were the Sumerian city-states in ancient Mesopotamia. There were the Greek city-states in the ancient Greek world, and in the Middle Ages and beyond, there were the Italian city-states. These were usually fairly small polities in terms of population size and geographical area, and they usually centered on one major urban center with enough farmland and farm villages around to basically feed the urban center. So paramount chiefdoms were kind of the size and took on kind of the shape and some of the way of life of city-states. Again, there are some ways that they're quite different as well, but that will suffice. And like the city-states, say, of Italy, because there are so many basically small, separate, independent political entities, we could say separate countries, to keep it simple, all kind of packed into this sort of one area, there's a lot of complicated interactions between them. The Italian city-states are famous for all kinds of complicated trade relationships, alliances, breaking of alliances, wars, like backstabbing, politics, all kinds of treachery, and sure enough, here in this region, the Mississippian paramount chiefdoms have a complicated relationship to each other as well. At one time, the city-state or chiefdom that was centered around, or the center was Cahokia, the largest urban center ever found in North America. Cahokia conquered the others at one point. But at various times, they were independent of each other, had peaceful relations, traded with each other peacefully. But again, this was a sort of a tug-of-war, back and forth, kind of fluid situation. The geography and the political geography made it such. Professor Mann, again, Cahokia was one big piece in the mosaic of chiefdoms that covered the lower half of the Mississippi and the southeast. At one time, a few larger polities dominated the dozens or scores of small chiefdoms. So the sort of back and forth nature of all this, kind of small these were within each city-state, right? The power is centralized and hierarchical, meaning there's sort of one person or one government that does control, but they're independent from the one that's next door and the one that's to the east and to the south, etc. At least unless they're conquered by them. Cahokia then was quite a find. At its height, it probably had a population of about 20,000. Is an urban center of 20,000 a big deal? Well, not to us today, but going back that far, yeah. And you look at the dates below when Cahokia was probably the dominant force in the Mississippian system. To have an urban center that large at that time is quite a technological organizational achievement. And so this is on par with anything that was happening in Europe at the time. One of the ways that we see another example of complexity and evidence that Native Americans weren't backwards compared to Europeans, as is so often been claimed in the past. This is incredible complexity. And these are, of course, are dramatic, artists' renderings of what it probably looked like. These came from scholars, sort of telling the artists, okay, here's how it probably looked. So they come up with it's kind of like a police sketch of a suspect in a crime that the witness is remembering. So we don't know if it's totally accurate, but it's probably relatively accurate. So if it looked anything like these two pictures, it was impressive indeed. Those are large structures. They appear to be pretty sound structures. Large urban area. Again, 20,000 causes us, I think, to kind of go, but remember, presentism is, again, an issue. At that time, 20,000 was quite an achievement. In fact, we tend to take even the cities we live in today for granted. Think, big deal. So, Sacramento area, 1.5 million people, the greater Sacramento area anyway, or so. Not that big. It's an incredible achievement. Incredible. To have 20,000 people, 1,000 years ago, a couple thousand years ago or more, right, is an achievement. To have 1 million plus people sort of living, working, together in a way that basically works is an incredible achievement as well. One historian whose specialty is the history of cities, urban development, the most famous of them, in his most recent book, which I read, wrote somewhere in the introduction that cities are humankind's greatest achievement. When I first read it, I went, I kind of hemmed and hawed. But as I kept reading on, I thought, he's right. But it's kind of unfair that he says it. The reason that it's kind of unfair is that what makes cities such a great achievement is it's not just one achievement, it's hundreds or thousands of achievements packed into one place. But nonetheless, it still makes the point, wow, these places are incredible. And I always share this story as just one example. And it shows how quirky I am, to put it mildly. But years ago, yes, I've been doing this for a long time, I was driving home after a night class after doing this exact lecture. This is before PowerPoint, by the way, but nonetheless, this lecture. And I was leaving the parking lot of the college, and my car was waiting at the stoplight to sort of move from the parking lot out into the streets. And I was looking at a red light, and I was thinking about the lecture that I just done. And it popped into my head. I have no idea why. It's because I was looking at the red light, but why I thought this, this question came in my head, I have no idea. Let's backtrack again. It was the red light plus the class I just taught on this subject, but I still don't know why. It didn't pop into my students' heads, I don't think, on the way home, but it did mine. And the question that popped in my head is, I wonder how many stoplights there are in the greater Sacramento area. It just popped into my head. Right? This happens to us all the time. All of us. Where do our thoughts come from? Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. I've said this many times before, but if any of us, all of us, could and did, were able to record our thoughts. Like in the morning when we get up, we sort of press play, have this sort of machine kind of hooked up to us, and we go through the rest of our day, and then hit stop, and then we can, it provides a transcript. We can print out on our computer of all of our thoughts during the day for a 24-hour period. We'd look at that and think, I must be nuts. Look at this. I was thinking this, and all of a sudden this popped into my head, and I was over here, and some things make sense, but some things just pop into our heads for reasons that we don't even think about, we probably don't want to think about, or that we'd never know. So that's part of what happened here, a common occurrence for human beings. Nonetheless, I then thought about it. I wonder what the answer is, and to this day, I don't know. I wasn't that curious. So my educated guess is that there are probably tens of thousands of them. I don't think it's probably in the hundreds of thousands. That's probably true in places like New York City, some of the bigger cities of our country and the world. But in our kind of medium-sized city, I would guess it's like 30,000, maybe as high as 80,000, somewhere in there. That's my ballpark. And so, okay, but big deal. They're stoplights. It's just basic electronics and some, metal and some, basic electric lighting equipment. Who cares? Okay. At one time, that was a technological achievement, of great accomplishment. But now, it's at the very least, or at least is still an organizational achievement. To coordinate, let's say, 50,000 stoplights, and they work. The system works. Not perfect. They go out once in a while during storms. As far as I know, I've never heard of a stoplight anywhere where it was like green all four directions at the same time, which of course produced chaos and death and mayhem. But these things work, and so it's the size, the vastness of the organizational structure or infrastructure that has to be and is put in place that makes us impressive. And that is just one of hundreds or thousands of things like it that are all bundled up to make a city work. This is why I think that historian is correct when he says cities are humankind's greatest accomplishment. Of course, they didn't have stoplights in Cahokia, but you get the point. Cahokia itself probably had, if not thousands, hundreds of different technological, organizational systems, devices, networks required to make life work. And of course, there were problems and things that didn't work, just like in our cities now. We still have crime and potholes and everything in between. But more or less, it works, so most of us, most of the time, can get through our day, and relatively happily. The Mississippian cultures were one of those groups that eventually moved big time into production of crops, domestication of plant and animal life, and it was mostly corn that was farmed in this area. So they became skilled farmers in an environment that certainly was suited for it, a fertile river valley. Most of the first civilizations or societies around the world to move to farming happened in and around fertile river valleys. Egypt along the Nile, the Fertile Crescent, Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Yellow River in China, etc., etc. River valleys are the most commonplace for agriculture to begin. But it appears to still have spread here and not invented here. Came from Mesoamerica and eventually to the Mississippian culture. But this was a place that certainly was well suited for it naturally because of the plentiful rainfall in a fertile valley, fertile river valley. At Cahokia, Professor Rourke says, skilled farmers supported the large population with ample rows of corn. So corn became the staple crop here. We talked about wheat before, but that's in other areas. The remarkable features of Cahokia, I'm not going to read the whole list there, but you should study this, since Cahokia will for sure be a study guide term, or is a study guide term, so it makes sense to look at this. Cahokia's neighbor, also an archaeological site that was found, is also impressive. Its kind of nearest city-state a paramount chiefdom neighbor. And if this artist's rendering is anything close to accurate, this was impressive indeed. This city, urban area, along with Cahokia, as you can see in this painting, had a wooden wall around it with palisades at sort of the exact same distances from one to the next and the one after that for defensive purposes. Obviously, these people knew warfare. You don't spend the time and resources and effort to build a big defensive fence around your large city unless you've been attacked before. So the fact that these places had walls shows us that they weren't always peacefully trading with each other. Sometimes they were taking stuff from each other by force. Again, I'll let you sort of look at the details there yourselves, but also worth looking at. Now we move to the American Southwest and focus primarily on the Anasazi, the most famous of these cultures, and there are some differences between them that are interesting, but we're going to sort of focus on those that are the same, that they had in common, and as our specific example, deal with the Anasazi only for reasons of time. By now, much admired Professor Rourke says cultures characterized by agricultural settlements and multi-unit dwellings called pueblos. About 3,500 years BP, for the present, they began to cultivate corn, their signature food crop. So another group of Native Americans that moves to the urban agricultural way of life, and when they do so big time. The demands of corn cultivation encourage hunter-gatherers to restrict their migratory habits in order to tend the crop. Southwestern Indians became irrigation experts, conserving water from streams, springs, and rainfall, and distributing it to thirsty crops. This area, the center of Anasazi society, is kind of right in the center of the crosshairs on the borders of what are today Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. Those, of course, weren't designations then. That's just to give you a sense of where they are now. This is an area where there are spectacular archaeological historical sites that you can visit today. They are spectacular. So Anasazi and Hohokam and other irrigation systems were quite sophisticated, even standardized to some degree with this kind of specifications, not exactly, but you see on the right. So one of the things that's most astonishing about all of this, of course, is this is not an area that you'd expect large-scale agriculture to flourish, if to be there at all, because it's a dry, arid area. Think of New Mexico. Not that all of New Mexico is this, but we tend to picture it. I know I do. I've only been there once or twice, but it's kind of like this vast area of kind of open, like desert land. It's not. There are some beautiful mountainous regions, but a lot of it is like that. I picture one of my favorite TV shows is Breaking Bad, and I picture Walter White out there, in his van, cooking meth out in the hot desert. And so that's not a place that I give that. I say that to you to give you an image, if in fact you've seen that show before, of kind of the hot, dry desert. Not a place that we'd expect farming to flourish. And yet the Anasazi made it flourish with their learning, their knowledge on application of irrigation techniques and systems. Quite extravagant. And when archaeologists sort of found and find these kind of projects, and by the way, the irrigation systems are engineering projects. That's civil engineering. And part of the reason I point that out is to, again, show us the complexity in all of this. Engineering is one of those subjects that intimidate people. Oh, you've got a PhD in engineering? Okay. Right. I met a guy on a plane one time. We were, you always ask somebody you meet, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? And he said, I'm a physics professor. I forget if it was like Yale or Princeton or something, and I wanted to just ask for a new seat in the plane because I figured I've already lost This guy blows me away. There's something about a PhD in physics professor at an Ivy League school that's intimidating. So physics, engineering, these are kind of intimidating subjects. So I want to give this the degree of complexity that deserves. The Anasazi people were doing complex civil engineering, no doubt about it. These irrigation networks were extensive and high-tech for the time. Not just digging ditches, it's a whole network of interlocking, and sort of understanding of hydraulics and building of dikes and dams. So this is extremely sophisticated stuff. But when archaeologists find any kind of engineering project, whether they're pyramids, earthen mounds, extensive irrigation systems, they know that they're looking at a society where there was hierarchy and centralization of power, even if they haven't found evidence of that yet. And they also know they're in an urban area. So hierarchy, centralization, urbanization, and this, of course, also goes hand in hand with extensive farming. So, as I said, when we talked about pottery in the eastern woodlands, scholars know when they find one thing, what other things are often or always connected to them. So why does finding, and I don't know if they found the irrigation canals first, they may not have, but why would finding such irrigation systems lead them to conclude that there was centralization, urbanization, farming? Well, we know urbanization and farming go together already. We already know that part. Hierarchy and centralization. First of all, what is hierarchy? Hierarchy of power means top-down power. So one person, like a king, right, or an emperor, or a small number of people have a top-down system where only a few or one get to make the decisions, and everybody else has to live by them, and they're legally binding over a large geographical or population area. So there was hierarchical power here, top-down, as opposed to egalitarian, where power is spread out more amongst more people. Decision-making is something closer to democratic. Centralization of power is often related to it, but not necessarily the same thing. So centralization means when one central government, it could be a king, it could be a parliament, a congress, but power kind of emulates from one center, usually an urban center, and radiates out from there. So laws are made there that are obligatory if you live within the borders of that polity. So we see both hierarchy and centralization here. But why does that automatically follow from extensive irrigation systems and networks? It's because those kind of projects are so big, they don't get done without hierarchy. They don't get done without centralization. It's like impossible, at least in earlier times. In recent times, very recent times, democratic societies can get these things done, but not too far back in history. It's impossible. So let's just give an example. Hypothetically, the Egyptian pharaoh, we're not talking about Egypt, but that's why it's a better hypothetical example. If the pharaoh living at the time wants a pyramid tomb built for himself, and he's competing with pharaohs that have built tombs before him, so he wants his to be the biggest, baddest pyramid ever, how's it going to work if he sort of gathers the people together and say, okay, I need to build a tomb for myself, a pyramid. Let's see by a show of hands how many people want to go out into the hot desert sun for the next 15 years of their lives for low or no pay, under incredibly difficult conditions, terrible food, it'll be blazing hot, most of you will die within a year anyway. Let's see by a show of hands. Who? Nobody? You know what? Never mind. I don't need a pyramid. Bad idea. That's not how it's going to happen, because it's not going to happen. Right? The pharaoh is going to say, you are going to go out and work because I said so. Because I have the hierarchical top-down power to command and make you obey those commands, or else. That's hierarchy. So this kind of massive series of irrigation canals and systems don't happen without hierarchical power of some sort. Centralization, well, this just is required here because you need numbers to do something as vast and widespread as lots and lots of irrigation canals. You need lots of workers, and so in a group of hunter-gatherers of 50, you're not going to be able to build that. In a centralized area, right, there's going to be a larger population at the leader or leader's disposal. Centralization, by the way, is still around. A good example of this is the United States to this day, the very subject overall of our course. So let's just fast forward to the present, and I'll ask you, is the United States an example of centralization of power? What's that? The answer is yes, you're right. It is, of course. Now, with an asterisk, because we do have a federal system where the central government shares power with the states and local governments to some degree. Nonetheless, in some ways, this country is heavily centralized. And a great example of the incredible sophistication of centralization in the modern world. Right? If you think Pueblo Bonito, by the way, the center of the Anasazi system, centralization and hierarchy of this Anasazi system, you think that is successful centralization. The United States is 330 million people, approximately, right, in a vast amount of territory, far larger than the Anasazi region we saw in the map in the previous slide. So it's an unbelievable example of successful centralization of power. And if you don't think power is centralized, do the following experiment. Not really. I wouldn't advise it. But hypothetically, this coming April 15th, right, don't pay your taxes. So if you're still living at home, tell your parents not to pay their taxes. And you will get a lesson in centralization of power. Because you might think, well, especially here in California, you might think, well, I'm not going to pay my taxes. They're not going to really care, or they're not even going to know. The capital, right, is sort of way thousands of miles from here. We're out here on the left coast in California. They're not going to know, and they're not going to care if I don't pay my taxes. Yes, they are to both. And not only are they going to know and care, they're going to squeeze every penny you owe them out of you. That's successful centralization of power. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. I'm just saying that is the definition of successful centralization. The Anasazi are well known for their architecture, particularly their dwellings, which were built right out of the cliffs. Sometimes these peoples are called cliff dwellers. Clever name, right? One of the groups that kind of came out of this is the tribe known as the Pueblo Indians, kind of named after their structures, the Pueblos, sometimes as large as 5 stories with 650 rooms. That's sort of the largest one, but these also complex structures, sort of the towns in a sense, the homes are built right out of the side of the cliffs and the mountains. Multi-story adobe apartment houses in some cases. The pictures here are interesting. None of this stuff would have been possible without the, again, urban agricultural connection, centralization, hierarchy. All that stuff is of a piece. It's all related. The picture on the bottom right looks to me, if I didn't know better, I would say that's like a Roman ruin from, ancient Rome. So another example of complexity, in this case architectural and technological, that's on par with what Europeans were doing at the same time. Back to this slide, Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, again an incredible archaeological tourist site today. It's a great place to go. Professor Rourke says, Pueblo Bonito stood at the center of thousands of smaller pueblos that sent food and other goods to support Bonito's spiritual and political elites. Exactly how the Pueblo Bonito elites exercised power over the satellite pueblos is not known, but it probably involved a combination of violence and spiritual ceremonies. I like the combination there. Nonetheless, they appear to have found a way to keep everybody in line, to do what they're supposed to do what they're ordered to do. Another expert on Native American history writes, all roads led to Chaco Canyon, and the Chacoans built their own roads radiating out from their canyon center. The major roads were nearly 30 feet wide. They can still be mapped today, and they lie in straight lines between objectives, turning only at sharp angles and mounting over hills and bluffs. Another testament to the organizational and technological sophistication of the Anasazi people. All good things come to an end, as they say, and this is also true of the Anasazi. This culture and society collapsed eventually, and spectacularly at that. I don't mean in a good way, but during the 12th and 13th centuries, as Alan Taylor tells us, equivalent time period with the height of the Middle Ages in Europe, the Anasazi neighboring peoples went through a crisis. A combination of overpopulation, over-farming, and bad weather, just sort of drought conditions, bad luck there. Over-farming, how can you over-farm? Well, you probably already know it by now, but it's worth repeating. Some of you may not know that you can't plant. In the modern world, with the Green Revolution and modern understanding of soil chemistry, fertilizers, this isn't as true any longer, but it's still somewhat true. Land can get worn out from overuse. If you keep planting on the same piece of land over and over and over without a rest, without a break, the nutrients all come out of the soil, and you produce either no crops or inferior crops. And so land is kind of like people, need rest, need sleep. And so you have to leave fields fallow, which means basically empty. There are clever ways devised by human beings in the Americas and around the world to find some way to keep that land somewhat useful, even when it's not being planted. We won't get into that. But nonetheless, if you keep planting on the same land over and over again without giving it that rest, you're flirting with disaster, at least if you're relying on those fields' production for survival, because they're likely to eventually give out. And so did the Anasazi not know this after farming so successfully for so long? I think certainly not. What it must have meant is that they were desperate. The population was getting too big. Drought conditions were setting in. And we're going to have to plant the fields we have again and again. We don't have enough food. And we're going to cross our fingers that it'll hold up for one more season. That we'll get enough crops for one more season, one more after that. And they were probably trying to find alternate solutions, but didn't make it because it gave out on them. And we have evidence that there was a total social, political, economic breakdown and collapse in violence, massive violence. It's not that hard to find evidence of large-scale violence in archaeological digs. If you find enough skulls bashed in, say, okay, there was some sort of violent issue or problem here. So setting off, as Alan Taylor says, a chain reaction of crop failure, malnutrition, and violent feuds. So the Anasazi, the spectacular successes of the Anasazi eventually came crashing down. We now move to the Great Basin cultures in the rough area that you see in tan here, kind of centering on Utah, Nevada, much of Idaho today. And not all of the land there, again, I'm having to generalize here, looks like that kind of scrub land and kind of desert territory, but much of it is. You've probably driven through Nevada. I can't say it's one of the more enjoyable things I've ever done. I've done it all too many times. Some people might love this type of terrain. Some people do. Not me. I'm for trees. But nonetheless, there were plenty of Native American groups that lived here. And this was an environment that was tailor-made for hunter-gathering way of life to continue. And so it did. So even after Europeans arrived and started to show up in this area, they still met mostly hunter-gatherer groups, not groups that had converted from foraging over to farming. The peoples of the region, having to adapt then to a harsh and challenging environment, stuck to their nomadic foraging ways well after Europeans were there. One of the most famous groups in this region is the Shoshone Indians. And this is a quote from a book not about Native Americans per se, but about sort of the development of human culture over long periods of time. He uses the Shoshone as an example of a larger point he's making. But this just gives some, example of the diversity in economies and societies across and around Native America. And this is kind of unpleasant as an example. You'll see why. Although the Shoshone had no big game to hunt, jackrabbits were afoot, sometimes in abundance. To harvest them, the Shoshone employed a tool too large for one family to handle, a net hundreds of feet long into which rabbits were herded before being clubbed to death. Unpleasant to hear from our vantage point. The author says that, and I agree. On such occasions, the requisite social structure would materialize. More than a dozen autonomous families would come together briefly and cooperate under a rabbit boss. Sounds kind of funny. So they'd put sort of power in the hands of the rabbit boss. You tell us, orchestrate this whole thing, because we need to organize to hunt these rabbits successfully. The net's too big for one family to do it. Though the Shoshone spent most of their time with the minimum of social organization, the sudden appearance of cooperation between families brought latent social skills to the fore, and social complexity grew. Well, not only is it something new to us, at least in this unit, to see as one of sort of the major foodstuffs, jackrabbits being sort of caught under a net in mass and then clubbed to death. But by the way, the rabbits were only around here and there once in a while. This didn't happen every day. So these peoples ate mostly stuff that they gathered, plant life, not so much rabbits. But this did happen. And what the author is saying here in the bottom part of this quote is that, and this is one of the features of this, there's also an example of diversity within Native America. This people was not sort of used to cooperating all that much. They preferred to kind of go their own way and stay in their little small groups. But when they realized they were reliant to some degree on rabbits, when the rabbits were around, there were enough of them, we got to take advantage of it. But they're too fast and there's too many of them. And to catch them, the nets are too big. We have no choice but to cooperate with other families. Damn it. So it's like there's reluctant but necessary cooperation among a group of very independent, this is kind of like the libertarian group amongst Native Americans. They don't want to cooperate. They want to do things on their own. Rugged individualists. But nonetheless, they have no choice because of the requirements of successful jackrabbit hunting. If you didn't know, jackrabbits are pretty fast. Those things are incredible. Now we get to us, to California, California Native Americans. Language diversity deriving from environmental diversity. Or we could say cultural diversity, since language is a part of culture coming from environmental diversity. This is an example of something I also said in the introductory lecture, and that is that once in a while, history does like little laboratory experiments for us. Right? It's not an actual laboratory experiment. It's as if it was a laboratory experiment. So, earlier in this unit, I told you that environmental diversity is the first place to go to see and understand cultural diversity. That people living in sort of quite and vastly different ecosystems, whether it be deserts or forests or mountains or coastline, develop different cultures at first because of the environmental differences. I also said there are other reasons for cultural diversity, but that's the place to start. And so it's like California did a laboratory experiment for us. It's like, okay, is that true? Does environmental diversity lead to cultural diversity? So the more varied and diverse your environment is, physical environment, the more likely it is that your cultures will be diverse and varied as well. Well, let's throw a bunch of Native American groups, different ones, into California, right? An area that we know is full of environmental diversity. California is known for it to this day, and let's see what happens. And sure enough, what you get is arguably, and a lot of scholars do argue this, that California Native Americans, at least linguistically, and maybe in some other ways, other cultural ways, also was incredibly diverse, more so than maybe any other region in the Americas. So it appears that the laboratory experiment confirms that environmental diversity leads to linguistic and cultural diversity. By the way, I say California is known for environmental diversity. That's particularly true living in the Sacramento area. I say this just for its humorous effect. I'm a proud Sacramentan. I wasn't born here, but I've lived here ever since college, which means a long time. And I've heard this way too many times, where people that live here, who like living here, will say, well, the cool thing about living in Sacramento, and besides the weather, right? What's the only other thing that really ever gets said? It's about environmental diversity. It says, yeah, you're like an hour and a half away from the coast, and you're like an hour and a half away from the mountains in Tahoe. What a great place to live. Yeah, but that's kind of saying, yeah, it sucks here in Sacramento, but the cool thing about it is we're close to this and we're close to that. We're not too far from this. It's an odd selling point for a place to live, but it is an example then of or shows us that we live in an area that is known for its environmental diversity. So the as-if lab experiment does support the connection between environmental and cultural diversity. Acorns. What the hell's the picture of an acorn doing here? Well, after a certain amount of time, the acorn became either the or a staple crop for most California Native Americans. The centerpiece of the diet. A staple crop is sort of a main food source, or the food source. And acorns were abundant in much of California, as they even are now. Acorns come from, don't just say trees, they come from oak trees. And if you lived in this area for a long time, or even paid attention in a short time, there's lots of oak trees. And 1,000 years ago, there were way more oak trees. Why? Because there wasn't fantastic urban development, and there wasn't farming yet. Both of which, as I've already mentioned, forced the clearing of trees, the cutting down of trees. So there were most likely far more acorns then than there are now. So this is the reason that acorns became a staple of the diet of California Americans. And it's all the more amazing, or it is amazing that this happened. Why acorns? Because acorns have one little problem as a staple food source. They're toxic. That is a bit of a problem. They're not like drop-dead toxic. I suspect, and I'm not an expert on this, but I suspect they're kind of like, E. coli toxic. You're going to get really sick. But that's still not good if you're going to rely on this thing as a staple crop. In fact, it would make it impossible. Rourke says, though there was a great diversity of Native American groups in California, all shared the hunter-gatherer way of life and reliance on acorns as a major food source. Okay, there you go. He said the same thing. So if they're poisonous, then what do we do? Well, they had to figure out a way to leach the toxins out of the acorns. What? Yes, and they did. Now, when you see the next slide and see how they did it, it doesn't look like that big of a deal. But remember, what did I say before? Why didn't I think of that? Something sounds easy, right, on this side of it, but on the far side of it, prior to its invention, it didn't seem quite that simple. Because I'll be dead honest with you here. If somebody walked up to me right now with an acorn, let's say I didn't know what it was, even if I did know what it was, well, I know the process now. Let's say I didn't know what it was. I said, hey, Christian, it's my name. That's my first name. Yeah. What do you got there? It's an acorn. Okay. I need you to do something with it. What? Well, it's poisonous. It's toxic. I need you to find a way to leach the toxins out of it. I'd be like, what? I don't know. Cut it in half. Leave it out in the sun for overnight. I don't know. Wrap it in tinfoil. I have no idea. Right? So the point being, other than humor, that this is a complicated problem. This is a quasi-scientific problem. Right? This requires really a scientific answer and scientific mode of thought. Now, they didn't have scientific method at that point. That's why I say quasi-scientific. But this is a complex problem to figure out. Now, the solution looks simple because it involved a process of boiling, grinding the acorns, and then boiling it in water, and then repeating the process again and again. And they figured out, probably through trial and error, that when you first boil it, the water gets sort of very brown, and that is a sign that the toxins are still there. So you drain it, put it in water again, and it should be less brown. And by the time the water becomes clear, you got two thumbs up, and you're good to go. The toxins are gone. So you don't need to remember the steps, by the way, which is the bottom, but you can read that if you're interested. So leaching the toxins from acorns, California Indians relied on acorns, but they couldn't have done so if they hadn't have figured out how to do this, a complex process. The Chumash Indians are known for their reliance on acorns. In fact, there was conflict, mostly within various sort of elements of the Chumash tribe, Southern California, center near Santa Barbara. Damn, they picked a nice place to live. Ever been to UC Santa Barbara, the campus there? My goodness. How does anyone ever study that goes to the school there? I visited it when I was in college for the first time, and I couldn't believe it. There's dorms like on the beach. That isn't right. Anyway, so the Chumash were around the Santa Barbara area, and their acorns became such a valuable commodity. There were wars. Acorn wars? Sounds silly, but really there were. But it's not really silly. Any valuable commodity or resource is going to elicit competition in the world, and violent competition sometimes at that. Oil, for instance. How much conflict has there been over that in the last 50 years? So a plentiful food source, and at some point I think the challenge and response dynamic kicked in here, but not so much because of an emergency like we're going to die, all of us. It's an existential threat unless we figure out a way to leach the toxins out of acorns. But the challenge and response was, if we do figure this problem out, we'll never have to worry about food again because there's acorns, in a huge abundance. So there can be various permutations, I think, to challenge and response. It doesn't have to be a dire threat to survival. I think that's the most common way that it becomes activated. In this case, I think it's probably something closer to what I said. We now move to my favorite group of all in our regional look at Native American change, complexity, diversity, relation to environment, etc., the Indians of the American Northwest. And I put a number of those that are pretty famous there at the top. This group had spectacular achievements, known for permanent or semi-permanent villages, yet another of the minority of Native American groups that moved to permanent settlements before they undertook agricultural development, and because they're living in a Garden of Eden area. They don't need to run around to get food, and they don't need to plant it either. It's kind of jumping into their laps practically. This is in a coastal area. We're talking mostly about coastal groups here in this similar group of cultural clusters, village clusters. And coastal areas are often areas where, not all coastal areas, but it's more likely that a coastal area is going to be one where you can have sort of a Garden of Eden situation where there's hunter-gatherers, not farmers, but they're still building permanent villages and towns. There's one simple way to explain this, and I'm simplifying it greatly. So this is more for you to remember it than it is an accurate portrayal, but it makes the point accurately enough for us. So other hunter-gatherers are hunting plants, and I'm sorry, got that wrong. Hunting animals, and I'm going crazy here. I haven't had that much to drink, I promise. No, I'm kidding. So hunting animals, right, and gathering plants. Okay, so they have two kind of separate food sources. On the coastline, you got fish and seafood. So you got your hunting animals with like bows and arrows and spears. You're gathering wild grains and vegetables, and you got seafood as well. Who has it better than that? This group. So they kind of have three food sources and not the typical two of hunter-gatherers. Kind of hunter-gatherer seafood. So that makes the point simply. They built supra-familial villages, which means kind of the larger extended family in one village. These were hunter-gatherers that probably knew agriculture, living in sort of these villages that were actually quite close to each other. So, and sometimes because of this, there were political rivalries that developed, and violence, a hierarchy of power that develops in such situations more often than not. They had incredibly sophisticated, diverse technology, specialization, one-man canoes, 8-man whaling boats, 60-foot cargo boats made out of wood, canoes that they made that they're famous for, different fish hooks for each fish, harpoons of different types of traps for bear, deer, elk, 4 different kinds of salmon traps. They built ornate shields made out of copper, had handloom woven decorative robes, in 4 different colors with 4 different dyes that they used. So this rather fashionable clothing that stands out. And I don't have this in the text, but you see it in the picture on the left hand side. The sort of artistic feature of their culture, and maybe what they're most well known for today, are their incredible wood carved and colored totem poles. To me, the cultural, technological achievements of this group are spectacular indeed. They built ranch-style houses, average of about 3,000 square feet, smokehouses for curing fish, cellars for storing it, watertight cedar boxes for storing berries, and it goes actually on and on and on. In most of these places, each family kind of owned their own individual boat. And so there was some competition, and here an element of private property. This is something that's an example of diversity difference than we've seen from other groups. Nonetheless, they still had a system whereby people cooperated together. So everybody owned their own salmon boat, and what they sort of took in, what they caught, was technically theirs, but the value system, the customs, were such that the people learned to spread the salmon out. So if one family goes out one day and comes up for whatever reason short with no salmon, another boat, another family that has more than they usually catch, then gives some to the family that didn't get it. So people are helped out. And this is a great example of reciprocal altruism, because this isn't being done necessarily out of love for the other family, though that could be true as well. They're your friends and you want to help them out, you feel bad for them. I'm sure that's in there at least sometimes as well. But of course, the more, I think, the practical reason for doing this would be, okay, I have a lot of salmon here or whatever. My next door neighbors didn't get any. I don't really want to give them any of my salmon, but why would you do it? That's right, because you know that someday you'll probably be in the same boat, pardon the pun, as well, and you'll need it. So if I reach out and help them, then they're obligated and will likely reach out, or someone else in our community will reach out and help me out. So what goes around comes around. This also really was insurance. This is the same principle as sort of actuarial figures and thinking, at least in a rough form. It's like an insurance policy. This isn't as well known as it should be. If you have, say, car insurance with whoever, Geico, right? If you get into an accident, who pays that for your car to get fixed, or a new car if it's totaled, heaven forbid? Everyone else that has Geico insurance. That's what your premiums are going to, right? So it's not so much the company that's paying it, though they're the ones collecting the money and have it in a fund, but it's your premiums and my premiums and everyone else's premiums are going to pay off, the payout for this and that and another car accident that someone else in the Geico pool gets into. That's kind of what they're doing here. Insurance for those, salmon insurance. So I like to point that part of it out also to show that this is more complex in terms of its kind of institutional structure than it may at first seem. Fierce duels of generosity. The potlatch ceremony of Native Americans of the Northwest. This is one of the favorite institutions of anthropologists going back a long, long time, going back to Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict, two of the pioneers in the subject of anthropology. And they were baffled by this, actually, as brilliant as they were, where they saw these ceremonies and these feasts. The picture there is of a feast being put on by leaders. Chiefs or potential chiefs. They're kind of like running for office, trying to become popular with the people by feeding everyone and giving them gifts. They give away like lots of possessions. So you provide this this huge salmon feast and all kinds of things to eat and drink and gifts to everybody. And the goal is to make yourself popular, ingratiate yourself with the community so that they recognize you as the guy. And of course, that led to competitive, right, fierce duels of generosity. Someone else who wants to be the chief say, okay, and I can have a better feast than that. I'll give you more salmon and better gifts and more gifts, and does so the next month. It's in part, I suppose, you're popular because you've given them stuff. It happens in our political system even now. But I think the bigger part of it is something not quite as apparent. And this is in the red section in the middle. Chiefs had to work like politicians to get others to follow them and assist them in acquiring enough stuff to give away at a potlatch. The potlatch is the name of this competitive feast that is put on. If successful, the chief then has more loyal followers than before, and inspires confidence because he showed he had the ability, the charisma, the talent, the organizational ability to get big things done. So most of it is like, wow, how was this guy able to pull off this feast? Where did he get all of this stuff? Well, he made deals and he pulled strings and he, is a good sort of deal maker and bargainer. Okay, he's the guy I think I want as our leader. So it wasn't just they were getting free food. It was much more than that. Robert Wright from Non-Zero says, also, it was a time to share useful information, and since the generosity was ultimately reciprocal, it was a rudimentary way of using surplus to dull future risk. So this is also another kind of insurance scheme of sorts, where the chief is giving away lots of stuff. It wasn't all his own stuff. Some of it, again, he sort of dealt maybe with the neighboring village for. Gave something else away that he controlled to get salmon or whatever gifts back in return. We haven't really dealt with numbers 4 and 5 on our things to remember about Native Americans yet. So in these last slides here, I deal with those because we haven't really taken that on yet. The professor historian that I quoted earlier as having a chapter called agriculture as history's biggest fraud also calls human beings ecological serial killers, which are both exaggerations, of course, but I still like the phrases, and it makes them more memorable, easy to commit to memory. So I put question mark there as well. What's being said here? We've already kind of covered this, and that is that Native Americans certainly manipulated their environment to their own benefit, and in some ways, and sometimes harmed the environment, hunting animals into extinction, or at least partly. So it's thought. Also, I mentioned fire already, so I don't have to get into it really too much again. But sometimes the fires that they lit that did have give them short-term gains, help their lifestyle, improve their standard of living, sometimes had long-term negative consequences, as they found out, sometimes the hard way. So they didn't take care of nature perfectly. They really didn't. But did they take better care of nature than Europeans? I also am repeating this, but probably. So, as Professor Rourke tells us, enormous regions of North America were burned over. In the long run, fires created and maintained a diverse and productive natural environment. Fires, like other activities of native North Americans, shaped the landscape of North America long before Europeans arrived in 1492. They used fires for hunting, to get rid of, to burn off underbrush, for agriculture, to get rid of pests and, insects, etc., etc. But it did have a cost. There were trade-offs in this. Doing justice to Native Americans and their cultures without romanticizing them. This is as good a place as any to deal with this issue, so I put it here just after we've talked about Native Americans' sort of reputation for being, totally in harmony with nature and kind of being tree huggers, perfect, and Native American and Europeans as being, just sort of ruthless and tearing apart, the environment. I think that the truth is somewhere in between on this. And I lean on Alan Taylor yet again. He says this, I think, quite succinctly, clearly, and eloquently here, so I'm going to quote him again in a book called American Colonies, written several years ago. Professor Taylor says, writing about pre-Columbian Americans, meaning Native Americans before Columbus, is also fraught with controversy because we often enlist ancient natives, these peoples, in contemporary debates over our own social and environmental problems. To highlight the social inequities and environmental degradation of our own society, some romantics depict the pre-1492 Americans as ecological and social saints, living in perfect harmony with one another and nature. To refute that critique, more conservative intellectuals eagerly point out every example of native violence, human sacrifice, and environmental waste. By generalizing from such examples, the conservatives revive the mythology of the European colonizers that Indians were warlike savages with a primitive culture that deserved conquest and transformation. Often the debate deteriorates into a competition over who was innately worse, the Indian or the European. In fact, it would be difficult to make the case that either were by nature or culture more violent and cruel than the other, end quote. And I think that's an important sort of corrective here. And history often works this way, though not always. The truth in history is often somewhere in between. And I said not always, but often. So if you think, well, is the answer this or this? Well, it's probably a little bit of both. So were Native Americans right or Europeans right? Who is better, who is worse? It's probably in between. Now, remember, my conclusion here earlier on, and I'm continuing with it here, is that we give Native Americans their due more, and there's a lot they are due, as we've already seen. But I think we do so more effectively if we recognize their complexity and their sophistication, not just in the things that we want to praise them for, but even things that they can be criticized for, like despoiling the environment. They had the ability to do so. To deny that they did is almost like saying, well, they were too innocent and naive to mess up the environment. Europeans were constantly calculating, had these rational, complex plans, and then they screw everything up. Yeah, okay, there's some truth to that, but that still then sort of makes it sound like Native Americans didn't quite have the sophistication to be able to manipulate nature. They did. The same is true in warfare as well. Some Native American groups were relatively peaceful, and they have that reputation by those that want to romanticize them, kind of carte blanche, sort of, there's a belief that all Native Americans were peace-loving, at least compared to Europeans. That isn't true. There are some groups of Native Americans, the Iroquois Confederacy that we'll run into in this class early, the Comanche that we'll run into later in the class, that were known, quite rightly, for warfare, for their prowess on the battlefield, and sometimes their brutal tactics in battle. So even by claiming, well, Native Americans were peace-loving, Europeans were a bunch of violent, SOBs. That, in a sense, also, I think, kind of underestimates Native Americans. It's like saying they didn't fight because they didn't want to, and they kind of, they were too peaceful to really be good at it. They weren't sort of up for a fight. I beg to differ. Europeans learned the hard way that Native Americans were formidable, at least many of them, right? If it was a warlike culture, Europeans were in for a tough time because some of these groups could put up a fight indeed. Lastly, Native Americans in 1492, what did they think and do differently than Europeans? This gets to number 5 on our list of things to remember about Native Americans. And by 1492, I don't mean exactly in that year. 1492, of course, is Columbus's first famous voyage. He wasn't the first European to get to Europe, but he might as well have been. So it is the most important year. Why? Because the Vikings that had come before didn't stay, and they didn't leave a lasting impact on the Americas. From 1492, the Spanish and then the Europeans did, in mostly incredibly destructive ways, as I'm sure you know, for Native Americans, but an impact it was. So the operative date, the most important date, is 1492. So what I'm saying is, how did Native Americans think and do things just before Europeans arrived, just about that time? So we can kind of match up the two. And I'm going to contrast them with Europeans already to make the point, to better understand the difference and what was kind of unique about Native American ways of thinking and doing. I'm just picking 3 areas: religion, values, government. Native American religion was tied closely to nature. Sometimes it's referred to as animism. They believed in multiple gods or spirits, right? In contrast to European monotheistic religion, which by 1492 was mostly Christianity, Judaism, some Islamic influence in Europe as well, but all 3 of those are monotheistic religions, one God. And Native American religions were more closely tied to nature. Native Americans, through their religious beliefs and practices, didn't think of themselves as above nature. They thought of themselves as part of nature, not any more important or less important than any other part of nature, really. And I think this is where we can see evidence or an explanation as to why Native Americans probably did do a better job than Europeans of taking care of nature. They saw themselves as just part of it, just sort of being lucky to have the rights to be part of nature. That's not true in the monotheistic cultures, not true of Europeans in Christian Europe, right? Going back to the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, in one of the most famous passages, it says, God created man in his own image and then gave him dominion over the birds and fishes and everything else. So in European thinking, God came first, and then he created human beings, but then gave human beings the right to control, right, to dominion, right. The word domination and dominion come from the same root. So scholars and religious thinkers over the decades and centuries have disagreed on this, but some have said and still believe that it's saying that the Bible is giving Europeans or Christians the right to dominate nature. Even if that's not true, that's too strong. That's still quite different than the Native American view that comes from their religion, that we're just sort of part of this sort of whole complex, sort of interrelated, interlocking system of nature. Animistic religion in Native America and other places also is very much about religious practice more than it is belief. I'm not saying there's not beliefs, but it's more about practice. Christianity and monotheistic religions coming from the other side of the Atlantic tend to be flipped the other way. They have practices, of course, but it tends to be the beliefs that are more important. Religions that are more focused on the beliefs are called orthodox religions. Groups that are focused more on the practice are called orthoprax or orthopraxy. Orthodoxy, orthopraxy. You've probably heard the word orthodoxy before. It means proper belief. Orthopraxy, you may not have heard. It means proper practice. So Native Americans' religion was more practice-based and less belief-based. And their religious practices, their ceremonies, their rituals, their rites, were in some ways almost selfish. I don't mean that in a bad way, per se. But they had a tribe would have a priest, shaman, religious leader who was taught by his father to carry out the various religious ceremonies. And you were supposed to do them the right way. And there were different ceremonies for different things, different practical outcomes. So there was a series of ceremonies and rituals for rainfall. It was believed that if you do the ceremonies the right way as the priest, it will bring from the gods, the spirits, plentiful rainfall for crops will grow, or if you're a hunter-gatherer group, they'll grow on their own in the wild, but then you'll be able to eat. If you're facing an invasion by an enemy, then a separate set of rituals are done to give us courage and strength in battle, and on and on. So I say the religion was sort of selfish in the sense that they expected that the ceremonies were going to give them practical results they needed in their everyday lives. Christianity has a bit of that in it, but it's not as focused on that. As far as values are concerned, Native Americans had overall non-acquisitive values, and by 1492, Europeans not completely were well on the way to an acquisitive value system. Acquisitiveness means the desire to acquire stuff, right? To acquire wealth and things. So Native Americans didn't hold possessions as dear. We already know they didn't have a concept of private property for a long time. Europeans by this time very much did have a concept of private property. There's also the subsistence versus surplus issue, which we'll get to in a minute, and we'll finish by looking at government quickly. So non-acquisitive values, subsistence farming, subsistence thinking. Subsistence farming means farming, gathering just enough crops to feed the community, right? As opposed to what the Europeans were already doing, at least to a growing extent, and that is surplus farming, growing more than you need so that you can save some for a rainy day if you're not bringing in crops. I don't know, a drought or something, or more importantly for our purposes, trade. You can trade it. But it's not about just subsistence and surplus farming. I would argue that the entire Native American way of life was based on subsistence thinking, and by this time it was becoming clear that the lion's share of the way of life of Europeans was about surplus thinking. Right? Europeans are thinking about surplus. Grow more, create more, build more, make more of these products to sell for a profit. Native Americans are thinking in terms of, no, we just need to make as much, produce as much stuff as will help us to keep the society going and flourishing. Reciprocity, we've already talked about a Native American value, big time, a mutual give and take. Native Americans, as part of subsistence thinking, had, and this phrase is used today by Native American activists up to the present, take what you need and leave the rest. Right? Europeans were kind of thinking already, take all you can now and worry about the consequences later. So take what you need and leave the rest. That's also, I think, another way that we can see how and why Native Americans may have taken better care of the environment, built right into their value system than Europeans. All of this greatly contrasted then by the acquisitiveness and individualism of Europeans by this time, and even more so afterwards. I'm not villainizing Europeans here. There's a lot of positive features to acquisitiveness and individualism. I'd be the first to argue that. But of course, there's a big downside, and it got pressed upon Native Americans in a very brutal way, as we'll find out, as I'm sure you already somewhat or more know. Native American religion, already dealt with that. We can skip that. Native American government. This one is hard to generalize because there's so many different types of political structures. In our second unit, next time, we'll get to huge hierarchical empires, the Incas and Aztecs, but we'll save those for later. Paramount chiefdoms is kind of a middle-of-the-road type of political system in terms of size and power. But what I want to focus on are the bands and groups of hunter-gatherers, pretty small groups. By this time, 1492, it's not just 20 to 50. There are tribes sometimes that travel together in the hundreds, maybe even in the low thousands. Kind of maxes out there. They split up some of the time. But remember that when Europeans arrived, plenty of Native Americans hadn't moved to farming, didn't want to. Their lifestyle, their ecosystem didn't favor it, so they were still hunter-gatherers. And I want to focus on those groups because those are the ones Europeans are going to understand the least. When we get to unit number 2 and the last Aztec emperor Montezuma II, when Europeans come around, Cortez and the Spanish, and say, "Take me to your leader." They say, "Okay, there he is over there," and it's Montezuma II. Europeans automatically think, "Oh, that's their king," and they're not entirely wrong. The Aztec and Incan emperors kind of had the kind of top-down, snap your fingers, get things done power that European kings and emperors did. It wasn't exactly the same, but they were close enough. But when Europeans, whether this is the Spanish or the French or the English, come across a Native American leader in a hunter-gatherer group that has a tribal council that you see in the picture there around the leader or one of the leaders, and they say, "Take me to your leader," and they point, there he is over there, "Oh, there's your king." They have that completely wrong, and they're already then off base, and they're likely to get all kinds of other things wrong from there. From the start, they've got they have a misunderstanding, a big one. Europeans would often misunderstand these hunter-gatherer groups in more ways than just what kind of power the chief had. And that's because, unlike, say, an Aztec emperor, a chief, the leader recognized by the group council, the tribal council sitting around him here in a circle, doesn't have the power of command obedience. He doesn't have the power of coercion, meaning he can't just say, "You're going to do this or else." I'll send the police or the troops out to harass you, arrest you, make you fall into line. You're going to obey the law or go to prison. He doesn't have that kind of power. So when Europeans say, "Oh, there's your king," they automatically think he does have that kind of power because they're making an assumption that's wrong, dead wrong. So what kind of power did a hunter-gatherer chief have? He had the power of not command obedience, but respect and prestige. What? That doesn't even sound like power to us, even in a democratic society. So what does that even mean? It means, first, that they weren't obligated to listen to him. They kind of, decide that he's going to be the leader they listen to. Why? Because he has respect and prestige. But that brings another question. Why does he have that? Well, for lots of possible reasons. right? Maybe just an impressive guy. He's probably experienced. Native Americans in general tended to respect their elders and listen to the wisdom of people that had lived and experienced more than they had. He may have been gifted, a gifted speaker, a gifted thinker. He may have been a brave and successful warrior. He may have come up with solutions to problems. Let's say in the past 20 years, this group has been through 5 major existential crises. 3 of them wars, 2 of them, problems, say droughts, bad, or they don't have enough food. And all 5 times they went around the council coming up with possible solutions, and all 5 times the solution that the guy standing, put forward is the one they adopted, and it succeeded all 5 times. This is hypothetical, but you could see that this guy, after 5 straight times kind of bailing out the whole group with the idea that saved them, on 5 separate occasions, he's now got a huge reservoir of respect and prestige built up. So if there's a 6th major crisis, who are they likely to listen to? Him. But the point is, they're not obligated to. Let's say the 6th time, for whatever reason, they decide to go with someone else in the group's idea. What does he do? He goes home. He'll probably say to them, or mutter to himself at least, "You guys are stupid. I've been right every time. I'm right again. It's gonna fail. But okay, if you want to screw it up, go ahead." Nonetheless, they don't have to listen to him, and they might go with somebody else's idea. He might still come back as the leader the next time, but it might sort of demote him. He might not be seen with as much respect or prestige. Or if they go with his idea the 6th time and he gets it wrong this time, it's going to put a dent, at the very least, in his respect and prestige and his ability to lead. So this leader doesn't lead by forcing everyone to go along. He leads by getting them to go along through his own performance, right? How good he is at doing it. Europeans didn't quite understand that at the time.